Washika. Happy New Year's. Our speaker today is Siddhanta, and he's going to speak to us on breaking the misidentification with the false self.
Good morning, David. We have a moment of silence. Shake 'em. Of course, we lost one of our esteemed elders, Baba Jake, the other day. Morning, Mom. Talking to all y'all. Morning, Mom.
Right on. Good morning.
Come over to somebody's house for dinner after Satsang. Sunday meal. My mom doesn't live in Chicago. that song a few years ago on the gospel station GCI Sunday morning. It's stuck in my heart ever since then. I tried to find it and finally found it for this purpose. So, I have been asked to discuss a topic that I chose based on my own need or desire to share it, breaking the misidentification with the false self. One of the three doctrines of the Buddha, anatta, taking the not self to be the real self. And how this becomes a trigger for the experience of suffering. In my own case, about a month and a half ago, when we were doing a round of the considerations and asked to redo it and to look into the process and to get deeper into it, and just as part of doing that, I had one occasion just in doing the examples to really see a pattern that had been coming up. And it seemed to me that the thing was triggering all the incidents of suffering that I was describing was being misidentified with my concept of myself, but very specifically, very specific, to the point where I had to write them down and really see the pattern more clearly. And of course, to see that ultimately there is no permanent sense of self in the sense that we experience. There's only one permanent sense of self, and that's where the right identification comes in. So the misidentification that I and that we may experience is with a sense of self that is not permanent, and in many cases not even real to begin with. Certainly not real in the sense of a spiritual sense of the word real, which only means permanent. The only thing that's real in a spiritual sense is permanent. So nothing that's not real, nothing that is not impermanent can be real. So why the need to break this misidentification? This is the question that Guru Sahib put forth to me to discuss. Why is this even worth discussing? For me, to present a topic and to discuss it, what's the point? And what he stated was the point of breaking this misidentification, which is the foundation of our practice. On some level, what we do in Sadaji, early on in the Kula process, used to always bring up that phrase, break the misidentification. And I heard him, and I think I understood him on some level, but a year and a half later, however much, we about a year and a half into this now, right? This Kula process, I think I finally understood what that brother meant, what he was talking about, when he was saying, this misidentification can be broken, Siddhanta. You can break it, Guru Sahib says that the reason why the practice of breaking this misidentification is important is because, first of all, it interrupts our practice. Being misidentified with our feelings and a false sense of self interrupts our formal and our informal practice as we move throughout the day. This is what interrupts it. Emotions and feelings come up, and we become misidentified with them as being being ourselves, as opposed to just seeing them as part of ourselves. Just like we got feet and hands, and we cling to them, and they interrupt our moment-to-moment practice. Of course, that can be from minutes to hours, depending on how long we stay gone. And he also stressed that this was the very foundation for dukkha, for suffering. It was this misidentification. I'm going to read a piece to elaborate a little bit more on this. This one particular packet, I believe Rani Kumari brought this to us in one of our Kula meetings. It seems the name of this piece is called One Dharma, but this chapter is called Liberation Through Non-Clinging. So I don't know how many of you all may have had this piece. I don't know the author. Attachment to self. The deepest attachment that conditions our lives and understanding is the clinging to the concept of self. Although we may have some intellectual understanding of emptiness or even some direct realization of it, we continue to create a felt sense of self whenever we identify with any particular aspect of ourselves, of our experience. There are many examples of this. We can see this most clearly in our relationship with our bodies. This concept of body, which we usually hold and cherish, is often our first and most immediate response to the question, who am I? We wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, see the reflection of the body, and think, yes, that's me. When we look deeper, though, we can see that the body is not something in itself that we can call me or mine. Guru Sahib pointed out when we were discussing this, he said, we can usually get some type of intuitive glance that the body is really not us. It ages, but we can see that we have remained the same. But when we get to the realm of feelings and emotions, the ability to distinguish the real from the not real, that discrimination gets a lot more difficult. This is from his Who Am I book. And the part where he talked about the relationship between ego development and suffering. As we begin to look deeper, we come to the understanding that suffering cannot be based on having money or not having money. It cannot be based on any of the conditions to which we have been ascribing our suffering. The suffering can only be based on us and in a very specific way, our level of ego maturity. This is the key insight that you will gain the more you understand your ego. All of the suffering that we experience is due to our ego development stages with no exceptions. Remember, the bottom line is how to transcend this thing, how to come out of it. This is not a game of mysticism 101. There's no grade at the end of the course. The idea is to come out of this state and ease your suffering. Bear in mind that the payoff of doing homework and investigating the nature of your ego is that with increased understanding, you will be able to relieve the suffering you are experiencing. If you can see that your suffering is a direct result of your being stuck in a stage of ego development, where you expect the whole world to mimic your desires, you will simply drop the expectation, and in the dropping of that expectation, the relief. You will then mature, and with that maturity comes a decline or decrease in suffering. The only way we can mature is to consciously participate in the process of ego maturation, i.e. meditation. Out of all the forms that mithya, the mithya dristi, impermanence, all the different forms that it shows up and takes place, it's in the subjective realm of our feelings and in our sense of self that mithya and the lack of mithya shows up the strongest and is the hardest to break. We may be able to see it in other forms externally a lot more clearer and really work on breaking it, but with our own inner self, that's where the lack of mithya is and the state of mithya is much harder to attain. Now, he really pointed out that at this point, we talk about our feelings, right? And we become misidentified with our feelings get hurt, but it's very important to distinguish even between our feelings and our emotions. Feelings are something that basically arise out of interactions with reality, and we experience our feelings pretty much at the level of our impulses and senses. It's a sensory. You know, something happens, it produces pain or pleasure. That's a feeling. You know, and those come and go all the time. Emotions arise when we basically evaluate and judge these feelings as good or bad, so on and so forth. And that's where we begin to experience things like anger and anxiety, sadness, frustration. That's based on evaluating and judging our feelings. And then we become misidentified with our anger, with our emotions, with our anxiety, so on and so forth. And this becomes the beginning of the cycle of dukkha, because once we have created an emotion, that emotion creates a desire in us for things to be other than what they are in that moment, because that emotion is usually some sort of painful feeling. And that begins that cycle. That begins a cycle of dukkha. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to break our misidentification with our emotions. Now, we're not trying to eliminate our emotions. Okay, they're part of our, and we all know this, but the key, the thing that we're doing is we're not trying to eliminate, we're not trying to transcend having emotions. We're trying to break becoming misidentified with them, which takes us into the wheel of suffering. Back to this piece, Liberation Through Non-Clinging. Talks a little bit more about this. The sense of self also arises strongly when we identify with our various emotions like anger, happiness, sadness, or joy. These are more amorphous experiences than thoughts and therefore harder to see. Although thoughts may slip into the mind unnoticed, they still have a definite beginning and end. Emotions are more complex, involving feelings in the body, thoughts or images, and different moods in the mind. When we're not mindful, it's easy to personalize emotions, taking them to be self. This happens so often in our lives. I'm angry, I'm happy, I'm sad. And we solidify the sense of self even further when we go from I'm angry to I'm an angry person. In that moment, we have created not only a momentary sense of self, but a more long-lived self-image. We have built a whole superstructure of self on top of what really is just ephemeral, changing conditions. And this happens very quickly. The more we see emotions arising out of combinations of conditions, the less we personalize them. That's that dependent origin, that everything that comes into being comes out of some set of conditions. And in this case, emotions also arise out of combinations of conditions. This doesn't mean we don't feel them, but rather we stay free in the transitory experience of whatever the emotion may be. When we're not mindful, the strong force of emotions pulls us under, and their powerful energies toss us about. Mindfulness is like wearing the life vest. The emotions still come, but we are protected from drowning in them. We no longer take them to be self or I, but rather experience them as part of the flowing current of life. There's a great sense of freedom when we don't identify so completely with every passing state or mood. The mystic poet Rumi wrote, "What I want is to leap out of this personality and then sit apart from that leaping. I've lived too long where I can be reached." Now, the next thing that occurs after we become misidentified on an ongoing basis, and this starts in our childhood with various emotions, is that we begin creating specific ego concepts and images of ourselves, what Guru Sahib calls ego projects. You remember his series of workshops a couple of years ago, and he really got into that specifically, how we create ego projects. But these ego projects and imagers are developed specifically as a means to relieve ourselves of the suffering of not knowing how to manage our emotions, of becoming misidentified with them. These images of ourselves become our way of giving ourselves some relief from this suffering that these emotions create. When we can gratify and fulfill ourselves in any moment from our image, then there's some relief behind that. And the thing about these false sense of self in the form of our concepts is that they're a lot more easily accessible than other methods of relieving suffering. If I can't get to the mall to go shopping, if I'm broke, I don't have no money in my pocket, if I can't get to some sex, if I can't get to some food or drugs or whatever I might normally or would resort to, I can always get to my image. That's right there. I just got to go there in my mind. And then when I'm in the world and relating to people, I'm there. Of course, this is also subject to mythia. So sometime it work and sometime it don't, in terms of giving us that gratification. So therefore, we're still caught in the trap of suffering. Now, and Guru Sahib a couple years ago gave me a very interesting definition. We were talking about something in, multiple personality disorders, right? Schizophrenia and so on and so forth. The difference between a person who has a clinical multiple personality disorder and a quote-unquote sane person is that what we do is we tend to go from one ego image and concept, and we use that for a while, or a few months or a few years, and then we create another one, and we're going from one to the other. But there's a space of time, or it could go from one day, but there's a time in terms of the development of it. Basically, a person that has a multiple personality disorder, what they're trying to do is they've developed all these different images, and they are actually trying to sustain them all at the same time, from minute to minute, second to second. That's what makes them quote-unquote crazy. But we're still in the same process. It's just that for us, hopefully, there's a little bit more time lapse. We're not going from this to that in 5 seconds, whereas a person who's in a institution somewhere is trying to carry off all these at the same time. So in a sense, we all have multiple personality disorders. Absolutely. Now, in terms of my own case, as I said, the thing that led me to this topic was in seeing this. And, it's real clear that there's some real specific images that I have created from my childhood that I have developed to basically relieve my suffering and not knowing how to deal with my emotions as a young child, the things that I was experiencing. And I think the images that I developed were partially from the feedback of others, as well as just things that I saw that I could reach for, such as being a moral person. When I was a young boy, and I used to, growing up as a Hebrew and reading the Old Testament, and there's a lot of stories of morality in children that you see in the Old Testament. Joseph and the coat of many colors, and Daniel in the lion's den, and David and Goliath, and for some reason I saw that. I said, this is the type of person that I would like to be. So in my mind, I created this concept of being a moral person. Being an intellectual was another one. That was partially because, even as a young kid, I used to get all kind of awards and recognition for grades and all that kind of stuff. And that kind of stuff came kind of natural, intellectual pursuits. And so in that recognition, of course, that felt good, That, as 8, 9, 10 years old, that became an image for me, you intellectual. Then as I got a little bit older, I added on another one. As I began to read, I learned a lot about manhood through reading autobiographies of men. And so I began to see certain characteristics of what I saw as that were worthy to have as manhood. Didn't have a father in the house, so I'm putting together my concept of manhood. And one of the things that came with that, men are strong emotionally. They're not weak emotionally. They don't show fear. They experience it, but they don't show it. They don't cry. They experience sensitivity, but they don't demonstrate it. Well, again, in young mind, that made a lot of sense. You know, these are men who I'm reading about, I admire, I'm looking around me, and I see these. So this began the formulation of my own ego images. And at 43 years old, it's still there. Now, of course, the thing is that I got to see is that the law of Mithya with these images. You see, not only are not one of the things is that began to be, these images became a source of my suffering because other people were not experiencing my image at all, or definitely not as consistently as I wanted to be. Sometimes they might see it, or sometimes they wouldn't. Or sometimes some people would see it, and these were the people, you know, and then sometimes they wouldn't. And even in this little boy, you know, you feel his hurt and stuff like that. But even deeper than that, one of the things that Guru Sahib a few years ago pointed out to us about these ego concepts is that they're not even permanent in our own mind. And when he said that, I thought about that, and, you know, even though I identified with being intellectual at a young age, there have been times in my life when I have felt very stupid. There have been times in my life where I have not felt moral. And there are times in my life when I've definitely not felt strong. So this concept is not even real in my own mind. But yet, I'm still in the world trying to pass it off and expecting other people to validate this all the time, consistently. Something that in my own mind is not even consistent. Now, of course, these images and concepts lead to roles and patterns and scripts. So now you take on roles. So now I become a good person. And I become a strong brother to my brother and my sister and to my mother. You know, I'm a good son. I'm not going to cause her any problems. And so these roles and concepts develop, you know. And then these roles, because they involve relationships, you know, every role that we have involves a relationship with another person. Then there's behaviors that come with these roles in interacting with other people. And in my case, there was some very specific behaviors that came out of these images and roles that came out of them. So, for example, since I was too moral and too strong to ever be out of control emotionally when I was angry, then what I did was just detach in relationships. So basically my whole life has been, up until recently, getting a glimpse of this and trying to come out of it, has been one of a real lack of intimacy. You know, that was my way of dealing with my emotions. You know, I couldn't be seen as out of control, so I wouldn't curse anybody out, and, you know, with maybe rare exceptions, but that didn't go with my image. You know, because that wouldn't go with my image. You know, you couldn't be seen, you can't, you in control. But I could certainly be lovingly detached. So most of my relationships throughout my life, all the way across the board, have not been based on sharing, you know. And you know, there people have shared. For whatever reason, I discovered that somewhere in my 20s that people, for whatever reason, would share things with me and come to me with things and want to talk. But it was really pretty much one-sided, you know, because again, that fit in with my image. Okay, you know, I'm a healer. I can listen. I can be a good. I can be sensitive to other people's needs. You know, but I wasn't really sharing my own problems and my own heartfelt issues with other people. So that's been a behavioral pattern that I'm trying to come out of. Another specific behavioral pattern that has come out of this whole process for me, this was pointed out in the Kula process, and is that, you know, one of the things that became very clear early on in the Kula process is that these images of being intellectual and being moral and stuff was not going to be validated. And that was pretty hard to, you know, that was pretty traumatic early on. I would say those first 6 months, there was a lot of battle going on, you know? And a lot of it was because people was not going on with my stuff, you know, right, Darji? And, you know, well, they point out that I was wrong about stuff that well, you know, but that I know I'm right and disagreeing with my opinions and beliefs. And you know, this is not really part of my normal experience. You know, so it was, and then challenging my morality and all this, and it was different, you know, up front like that, you know, in the cooler process. So one of the things I began to do was to blame and condemn people in my cooler group, you know, mostly in my own mind, but even sometimes to others, you know, damn, why they like that, man? Why they, you know, tripping, big time, you know. And of course, that's some real serious lack of dosh, Dristy, you know, blaming them for creating my suffering because they wasn't going along with my racket. So, you know, that was real clear. And again, you know, in this process now, still working on it, still fighting, still getting knocked down. But you know, the behavior that comes out of these concepts and images and our desire to be validated can be very, very ugly. It can be very childish. It can be it's very selfish. It's very, you know, we make victims out of innocent bystanders all the time. You know. Doesn't mean that we're responsible for other people's suffering, but we certainly create pain for other people all the time. You know. And then, you know, it's interesting to even look at when we do get our feelings hurt. You know, when we talk about, well, I got my feelings hurt. Well, you know, one of the things out of that is, what's the difference between, even that is not being able to discriminate between sensitivity and pride. You know, sensitivity, when we have our feelings hurt, sensitivity, this ability to be sensitive to other people and be in tune with them, and then they might search something that really hurts our feelings, and we're sensitive to that. Well, in most cases, what we call getting our feelings hurt is that nothing to do with feelings, it's pride. And we need to be able to distinguish between the difference of having our feelings hurt and our pride. Usually it's just our image, and it's our false pride at that. That's what's getting hurt. It ain't got to do with feelings. Feelings, as Guru Sahib pointed out a few years ago, you know, you have to evolve to the point where you can have feelings that people can hurt. You know? And in my own case, it's very clear that throughout most of my life, when I say people have hurt my feelings, what they've hurt is my false pride. It ain't got to do with my feelings. So, what needs to occur to begin to come out of this cycle of being misidentified with our emotions, all these different images that we have? I didn't even write that down as a homework. I didn't give homework, but that might be one that might be worth considering. You know, what are our very specific concepts and images of ourselves that we are constantly interacting and bringing to other people and have them encounter? But what needs to occur is we have to be able to introspect. We have to be able to do a self-observation. We have to be able to introspect this whole concept of our emotions and our images and our ideations. But we have to be able to do self-observation from the point of right view, which is the dristis. And Guru Sahib really stresses, we have to do, our self-observation has to be done from the standpoint of looking at it from dristis. That's the only way we can do self-observation. Otherwise, what's really observing what? You know, we might find that our concept, our mental concept, is trying to observe some fact, some part of itself, such as emotion. We're caught in that trick bag, you know. And we have to really be able, therefore, we'll be able to see things as things really are, i.e. impermanent, i.e. lacking the value. So for me, for example, what that looks like is, rather than avoid my emotions, you know, I don't need to be trying to avoid them or to be afraid to show them, because they come, whatever this emotion is that I'm experiencing in that moment is just something temporary. So there's no need for me to avoid it, and there's no need for me to try to suppress it or to be afraid to even express it. However that might show up. If I want to shout, cry, curse, whatever. You know. That's an old song I heard. I went to church with somebody. Last time I went, about 4 years ago. There was a beautiful song. I tried to find that. Some of these songs are hard to find, but in the Spirit of the Lord would rescue me, I will sing as David sang. And they go through these different, but it was, you know, you sing, you dance, you make love, you cry, you tear. I cry, whatever it is I want to do, you know, because I see that my emotions are part of me, but they are not of me, and I can express them and be okay with that. But they have to be seen to the point of conviction. Otherwise, we won't do anything. You know, we'll see and say, oh, okay, that was nice, I saw it, cool. We got to be convicted that these emotions and the process that they create is what brings us into the suffering, and we will never be able to break it down until we decide that we are going to do the work that is necessary to break the misidentification. We got to be convicted about that. Right, Sadaji? The point of conviction. A couple of pieces about that. Of course, the Cultivation of Discrimination booklet that Dhamma Maj put together. There are only 3 ways to develop right view, other than the instant attainment of that view transmitted directly to us by the Guru's initial divine revelation. The first is by truly hearing and then listening to the Dhamma. By this means, one day we will eventually become established in the right view. One day, suddenly, we hear something, it will trigger us into right view. The second way is by making a very serious and profound study of the scriptures. Such serious study of the scriptures will eventually establish us in the right view, though it takes much, much longer than the first way. This is the way of the scholar, which has been my way most of my whole life. The third way has been considered the best way, the attainment of right view by experience. If we set our life in the palm of our hands and study it as instructed by the Guru, this will generate the right view much faster than the other 2 means. Truly and accurately observe reality, and you will automatically see things the way things really are, and that is right view. There is no alternative to right view, dristi. The ultimate nature of reality is impermanence, anicca, unhappiness, dukkha, and it is created by our own mind, maya. Once we are able to recognize and maintain the seeing of the ultimate nature of reality and get into ma'at with it, we will no longer impulsively generate the desire for things to be other than the way they really are. Then we will suffer no more. And there's another piece. The Luminous Mind, the Way of the Buddha, Kalu Rinpoche. And he talks about integration and transmutation of thoughts and emotions. Kind of like biology. When we are just beginning to practice, our mind bubbles and effervesces like a pot of boiling water over a fire. The practice of Rangbab teaches us to stop interfering with thoughts and emotions, which is like ceasing to feed the fire. Then the boiling will stop on its own. As beginners, we cannot remain for very long in a state of correct meditation. We are distracted by thoughts and emotions that we fixate on and cling to. We learn, though, not to follow them. Simply notice the presence of thought. We do not follow after it, but remain alert. In a state of detached observation of everything that appears to the mind. We leave the mind as it is to recognize what is going on within it, and we do not interfere. Simply seeing, as just described, is the state of the detached observer. When we remain in this state of uninvested vigilance as an impartial witness, thoughts and passions arise and disappear in emptiness like waves rising and falling back in the sea, or like a rainbow that lights up and stretches across space. Negative tendencies are no longer something to reject. They transmute themselves into primordial awareness through continued practice. Take the example of the desire between men and women. It is a passionate tendency, but its nature is bliss. It is possible, without either fleeing or following the impulse of desire, to experience its blissful nature, which is ultimately bliss void. The same is true of anger. Here again, it is possible, without either expressing or repressing anger, to experience its essence, the dynamic clarity of mind, and to develop the realization of clarity void. What is true of desire and anger is also true of pride, envy, and the other mental afflictions, which become transformed through the same meditation. So, ultimately, for me, what happened for me, what began to happen, I should say, about a month and a half ago, was what I began to realize is that, this path, of course, is really about heart, and what I need to do was start to develop and cultivate the heart to practice. I needed to develop and cultivate the heart to practice. More and more, Guru Sahib is always pulling us along. This is about heart. And he told me several years ago, Siddhanta, your mind is wonderful and all that, but what I want is your heart. He told me that several years ago. And of course, when he said that, I love the way it sounded and all that, but that doesn't mean I had the ability to respond to that in the way in which he was stressing that. But I think I have begun to really understand that it is necessary to develop the heart to practice. And it's necessary because it is the only way in which I can relieve my suffering. It's the only way. Through practicing with what he calls intention and attention during the time of formal meditation, as well as moment to moment, the touchstone sadhana and all that, that will eventually break the misidentification with these false concepts and with the emotions and feelings that create them. That's the only way. That's the only way that I have seen. And in my own mind, I have become convicted that there is no other way. So my practice has started to become much more vigilant and much more serious in terms of practicing with intention and attention. This is also the only way for me to begin to interact with other people in a way that can be seen as anything close to loving. That also becomes part of that motivation for me to break this misidentification, to break this need connection that exists in all these relationships where I need this person to validate. In the packet of cultivating discrimination, it gave Dhamma Maharaj, that was the most beautiful example of compassion I've ever come across, ever. And that is, I will relieve all sentient beings of the burden of making me happy. That is real compassion. And when I read that, it was straight to the heart. That is the most eloquent and simple and most powerful definition of compassion. Relieving other people of the burden of making me happy through validating me, my concept, my images, my feelings, and so on and so forth. That becomes real motivation to practice with heart. And of course, that's real Bhadadristi. That's real Bhadadristi. That's living, no one can make me happy. And not putting the burden on having them try. And that's living that I am not responsible for anyone else's happiness. That's compassion. That's real compassion. So I thank you for that definition. Guru Sahib told me she just I give her stuff and she don't know when to shut up. She just put she put all my good stuff in there. But I'm thankful that you did. Back to this liberation through non-clinging. The doorways to liberation. How can we accomplish this letting go, this awakening of the heart and mind? One powerful practice of non-clinging is the awareness of impermanence, which was discussed earlier as a way of turning the mind towards the Dhamma. Here it becomes the very practice of freedom itself. We can become aware of impermanence on every level, whether we observe clusters of galaxies through powerful telescopes or subatomic particles through the latest quantum experiments. Perhaps more relevant to our own power of observation is the obvious impermanence of our lives, the body aging, relationships changing, births and deaths of people we love and of people we've never met, the momentary arisings in the mind, and the endless falling away of all experience, like water over a waterfall. Reflect for a moment on the high point of your life, the most wonderful moment, or the low point, the most difficult time. Where are they now? We begin to see that all our experience is part of an endless passing show. You know, Satsang used to always use the expression, just sit back with a bag of popcorn and just watch the movie. Just watch the show. You know, just watch it. Of course, it's hard to watch it when you're an actor in the show. You can't do both. You're either going to watch it or you're going to be part of it. But you can't do both. So Guru Sahib saying, get off stage. You know? It's strange that when we look back at our lives, it becomes clear that all of our experience from years ago to even the last moment is like a dream. Yet in looking ahead, we are seduced again and again by the dazzle of possibilities. Whether it's consuming the next meal, a new job, the next vacation, or a fantastic new relationship, as if some new experience will finally fulfill all our longings. It's through seeing and remembering the truth of impermanence that we loosen the grip of attachment and clinging. Now, you know, I've been around the House of Ras for about 7 years now, and you know, it's really obvious that Guru Sahib put this thing together, that because he it is my belief that he and this man, Bilal Huzur, they put this thing together because they understood it's about heart. You know, and maybe perhaps they wanted to give us an opportunity to bring heart back into the hood. You know, or perhaps into the hood in this realm for the first time since the old hood, the OGs from antiquity. You know, I think that Guru Sahib and Bilal are giving us a chance to express and develop hearts that we can express and understand and express real intelligence, which comes from the heart. And to cultivate and to develop and express real creativity, which comes from the heart. And to cultivate and express real love, which comes from the heart. So for my own case, I think I'm finally understanding the labors of their love, that it's really about heart. And so my own personal conviction in terms of what I'm doing is trying to really live this sadhana, this practice, and this path finally from the heart and to come out of this mind. And to show the gratitude to my guru and to the ancestors and to all the gurus and to the efforts of Bilal, and even to the love and encouragement of the Sangat, the community. So that's where it's at for me right now. I'm trying to live this from the heart. So I'm going to end this now and open it up for any questions or comments about any of all this stuff. Anybody?
You just mentioned true creativity. Could you elaborate?
Well, I remember Guru Sahib a few years ago. Well, actually, I don't remember whether it was a one-on-one conversation or something, but he talked about creativity on a lot of levels, but the ability to create something more than what can be seen or heard in that moment. The ability to develop something that is not there. You know, creativity. That's a heart function. And when I say heart, intelligence. You know, and of course that has a lot of ramifications. You know, one of the things about creativity is it's a very important part of solving problems. You know, as well as just compassion is a form of creativity, coming from the heart and going beyond the senses. That's the best way I can explain creativity, to develop and to make something manifest, something more than can be seen or heard in that moment, until you have made something manifest out of your own heart and intelligence. Now, of course, you know, this is what the ancestors did. You know, when we look at their ability to create a whole civilization, and that is validated by those who came after them. How did they do that? There was no school. They didn't have any teachers. So it appears as though they created a whole civilization out of here and out of here. They simply knew how to go inside and create something that did not exist in that moment. So.
Have you noticed in your own life a definite difference in the way before you had the right view or the current view that you hold than when you first came in?
Have I noticed a definite? Well, as I said, you know, this is a process. I would say that maybe the last few months now, I finally am interacting with the world in such a way where I'm not bringing my concepts, my image into it and expecting that to be validated. I'm not looking to have my emotions. I'm learning to express and deal with my emotions just naturally and feeling free to do that, however it takes me, as opposed to automatically locking them up, per se. This process has been going on for years, you know, ongoingly, but I would say maybe the last couple of months. So just a little bit more freedom emotionally, but also in terms of practicing, the practice is much more conviction now, because I know what I'm trying to do. I know that for me, I am trying to end the suffering, this dukkha, at the very level. So, you know, my awareness is there from the beginning of the day. You know, and you know, I think I am beginning to see that situations that might normally create anger or anxiety or frustration because somebody is not validating my morality or my intelligence or something like that is not triggering the same level of force, you know. So I think that is beginning to happen, but it's a vigilant process because this thing has been with me for a long time. There's no way it's just going to stop. So the battle has to be, you know, much stronger, right, and much more stronger, because I know See, I know how deeply ingrained this is in me. Some other stuff, but see, this I know. This has been with me all the time. And it comes up before I'm even aware that I'm there. I'm there. So.
So it's to that concept that what Bruce was saying, that we have to empty ourselves to turn the cup up and empty out completely before we actually even receive the drishti, learning the drishti dharma.
Okay.
Or am I saying this correctly? Because that's what I'm saying for myself, that I have to dismantle everything to even get the correct teaching, the correct learning, the terminology, because you can't go on the intelligence and that's what I'm hearing from what you're saying. So, and is that what you're doing too? You're trying to totally, empty yourself so you can be clear.
Yeah, purifying the mind. That process that he gave us for how suffering arises, and at the very base of it, we're either encountering reality from a mind of suffering or from a mind of purified mind. And that will determine how we react and how we experience all the things that come up and back and forth. Well, obviously, my mind is already polluted, so I am in the process of purifying it, but purifying it of my misidentification. So now when I encounter any aspect of reality, a situation, a person, something that comes up, and that whole process, because feelings are going to arise, he gave us that model. Those feelings are just experiences, right? But what happens after that is what gets determined, how much suffering is created. So yes, the purify the mind, it doesn't mean that we don't get to use the mind as we try to understand these teachings. We have to, the intellect does serve a purpose.
Right.
But, in terms of helping us understand, but in terms of what you were speaking of, and when I'm saying, yes, we're talking about what he was talking about, purifying the mind so that when we encounter reality, we are not bringing conditions to it that will automatically trigger the experience of dukkha. And we will be able to move throughout the day. And I'm talking about a practical sense. We're not living on the clouds. We're in the world. And we're living, in a complicated world where all kind of things are going to happen. So we get to really be challenged to move throughout the day and with this as pure mind as is possible, and to see whether that's happening or not. And it's not like it would be difficult to tell, because if you're experiencing it in Mensa, doing our telephone satsang, he added on some other negative states, bewilderment and all these other type of things, and if we're experiencing any of these type of things, well, we know that mechanism started from a mind of suffering. Now, the meditation in the morning is our opportunity to start the day in a pure mind and carry that out throughout the day. But see, of course, even to do that, we can't even meditate until there's a pure mind. So, and that's what he said. You can't even meditate in a state of mind suffering. That's why we have to see this. We have to do the self-out. We have to really see what's triggering this in our own particular case. Because until then, we can't even take advantage of the meditation to enter into a peaceful state to go through the day, if that makes sense.
Is that sense of along with what you're talking about? Is that sense of I one of the root causes of anger and fear? I'm trying to apply that into my life, and so that the projection of I, who I present to other people and to myself, is that fundamentally?
Because if this I believes that it is smart and somebody disagrees with you, then that I is going to feel anger. So this sense of I is exactly what we're talking about. It is the root of everything.
So So
It is the root of all suffering.
So then
It's
they go-
false, but it's a false sense of self.
Okay. Okay.
We are misidentified because there's only one real I,
Mhm.
and that is God. So if we're not seeing ourselves as God, then automatically we're misidentified.
Mm.
You know, in essence.
So then the goal would be to break down the I. That be the
To break the false sense of self.
to break false sense.
Yeah. And so, in a sense, it's almost, as he has expressed, it's not even so much finding the real self, it's just whittling away. Once you just break down the false sense, there's nothing eventually that will be left but the real sense. You know? But that's the process. So it's not so much, and he reminds us this all the time. We don't have to look for God. We don't have to look for our real essence. It's there. We have to uncover it. So it's not like we have to go on a scavenger hunt, you know. Damn. God damn, where's it at? You know, where is it at? You know, it's here. You know, but we gotta turn it inward. But the problem is the first thing we're gonna encounter inward is all that other stuff that's already there. There's a lot of, that's the pollution to get to the real thing. So everything is inside. You know, the suffering is inside and the real self is inside. But it takes, there has to be something that triggers in the heart. And see, this is the thing because, you know, I know for myself, you know, this attempt to find a mental reason to practice based on the beauty of the teaching of the Dharma, based on understanding, hearing what he talked about in the booklet. Hearing something, you know, hearing all these profound teachings and trying to embrace that and use that to catapult me to really practice, or through the reading. But ultimately, the only thing that produces it is experience and seeing it. You know, and that's what he talked about in the cultivation of discrimination. And in my own self, I've had to see, because I didn't realize I was really, you know, in a state of suffering. You know. So, and that's true, because the thing is, you know, when you have identified with being able to be a listener and strong enough to handle other people's problems and all this other kind of stuff, and you know, I had to really see myself a certain way that didn't have anything to do with my own suffering. You know, so that in itself, the first revelation is David that you have to see is that you are suffering. You know, and that's what I had to see. And thank goodness for the cooler process and everything else. You know, because see, then you could say it's okay that I'm suffering. Because that's part of the human condition, and that's because I have had no other choice but to suffer. But you see, even my own concept of suffering was something as weak. That's why I could never see myself that way, because I saw suffering as weak. Especially the way I saw it manifested in my household growing up. You know, I didn't want no parts of shit. If this is how people express suffering, then you know. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that my whole life I've been, what would be the correct mental health disorder? You got therapists. No. So it's not that I was not aware of my own suffering, but I wasn't tuned in enough to feel, it wasn't urgent enough to want to deal with. I felt I was okay.
Right.
Okay, I knew I was suffering. I had problems,
Right.
but it seemed to me like my suffering was not as bad as other people around me, so it was okay. I could deal with my problem, you know. But it wasn't until I began to really get a closer glimpse of it wasn't really okay, you know. So that has taken a while. That's been a process, you know. So it's okay because that's how it is. That's what makes it okay. But I don't want to stay in this condition, you know. I would like to use this life for the purpose in which I believe that I've been given. I can't see other reason for being given the grace of a guru and everything that comes with that. You know, I can't see any other reason for it if I'm not going to use it to try to get as much as possible in this life. To try to do it right here, right now, to the best of my ability. Now, I don't know how it's going to turn out, and I don't really care. I'm not trying to figure that out. I'm just putting the work in. You know, if I put the work in, I do believe the grace is showing itself. So, any more? I feel like I'm babbling now. Any more questions or comments? Well, we're going to end this with a little bit more heart talk, because that's what this thing is all about. You know, it's the heart. We're going to do this first and then.
Want to turn it off? Let me turn the light on.
Easy to see with the lights. Can you still get it?
Yeah, I can see it.
Is it up?
And the beat of your heart. Love it. More than the lungs that need yet to breathe free air. More than the womb that holds life. More than the private parts that give life. Love your heart. This is the prize. Amen. This is the prize. Amen.
Wanted to hear that heartbeat at the end. Rashid.